The day my world shattered, it wasn't a sudden explosion, but a cold, calculated strike. First, my father-in-law, the CEO, looked me dead in the eye at a company board meeting and declared, "You're fired. Poor results." Then, that same night, my husband slid a list of women's shelters across our kitchen table and whispered, "You're on your own now." I remember thinking, as I walked out of that building like a criminal, that being publicly fired by my father-in-law was the absolute worst part of my day. They even had a security guard escort me out. But then I came home, and there he was, Jack, my husband, sitting at our kitchen island, scotch in hand, a piece of paper on the counter. He didn't even look at me when he slid it across the marble. A printed list of women's shelters, every single one highlighted in bright yellow, one circled with his own handwriting closest to the metro line. "Now that you're unemployed," he said, his voice as flat and emotionless as a corporate memo. In that instant, a chilling realization hit me. I'd been set up. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a cold, brutal, father and son operation to discard me like a failed quarterly report. But what they didn't know was that I had been planning something too. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To truly understand how I ended up holding a list of homeless shelters while my marriage dissolved in front of my eyes, you need to know about the life I'd so carefully built, the one that was now crumbling around me. It all started 3 years earlier at a cybersecurity conference in Boston. Back then, I was an independent consultant, and my future felt entirely in my control. That's where I met Jack Caldwell. Most people at those conferences were just there for the free lunch or scrolling their phones. But Jack was different. He sat in the back row, taking notes during my presentation on predictive threat architecture. He was engaged, leaning forward, his pen moving across the pad as I explained how my framework could identify vulnerabilities before attackers even knew they existed. During the Q&A, he asked a question that proved he wasn't just listening, he was truly hearing me, about scaling architecture across distributed systems without latency issues. It was a technical question, not something a marketing executive would typically formulate, let alone care about. After the session, he waited patiently while I deflected 3 other desperate consultants, then approached with a smile that felt genuinely warm, not rehearsed. We talked for 2 hours in the hotel lobby. He represented Caldwell Technologies, his family's firm, but he spoke about it with a measured distance, like someone who understood the business without being entirely consumed by it. He asked intelligent questions, shared insights, and truly listened as I explained my theories about the future of cybersecurity. When he asked for my contact information, it felt professional. When he called 3 days later to invite me to dinner, it felt like possibility. Our courtship was slow, deliberate. I interpreted it as respectful, thoughtful. Jack introduced me to his world gradually. First casual dinners, then a weekend trip to Cape Cod, where we walked beaches and talked about everything except work. Then, slowly, into his social circle of college friends and business associates. He never rushed, never pushed. He always checked in, ensuring I was comfortable with each step forward. At the time, that patience felt like profound respect. Looking back now, I could see it was also an assessment. Each stage, a test to see if I'd fit into the space he'd already designated for me. 6 months after we met, Jack took me back to that same Boston hotel. Same lobby, different conversation. He proposed over coffee, not champagne, in jeans, not a suit, with a beautiful, understated ring. Everything about it felt authentic, like he understood I valued substance over performance, partnership over spectacle. I said yes before he'd even finished asking, certain I'd found someone who saw me as an equal, not an acquisition. My mother's reaction was like a weather warning I chose to ignore. When I called to tell her the news, there was a long pause. Then, very carefully, she said, "That's wonderful, honey. Just remember, families like the Caldwells operate differently than people like us. You'll always be an outsider to them, no matter what Jack promises." I dismissed her concern as generational cynicism, the worldview of someone who'd struggled financially her whole life and couldn't imagine wealth operating with genuine meritocracy. Jack had repeatedly assured me his father valued expertise and results, that Henry Caldwell had built his company by recognizing talent regardless of background or pedigree. I believed him because the alternative meant acknowledging I was walking into something far more complicated than love. Our wedding, 8 months later, felt like it reflected my preferences: elegant, understated, intimate. Focused on commitment, not display. Only much later did I recognize how many of those choices had been gently steered by Jack's suggestions, his family's expectations dressed up as my own taste. I kept my maiden name professionally, a decision Jack publicly supported. But his mother, Patricia, made small, pointed comments about tradition and family unity at every opportunity. I took Jack's public support as proof of his progressive values, evidence that he was truly different from his father's generation. Now, I understand it was just another performance, granting me the illusion of independence while the parameters of my new life were being drawn around me in invisible ink. 2 months into our marriage, Henry Caldwell summoned me to his office. The building itself was designed to intimidate. All glass and steel angles, a lobby with ceilings 3 stories high, security protocols that required badging through 5 checkpoints just to reach the executive floor. Henry's office occupied a prime corner with panoramic city views, furnished with a desk large enough to land a small aircraft, and chairs positioned to ensure visitors always looked up at him. He gestured me to the lower chair, a power dynamic so obvious it bordered on parody. "Violet," he began, using my first name with the casual familiarity of someone who considered intimacy his privilege, not something earned. "Jack tells me you're one of the brightest minds in cybersecurity. We could use someone with your skills on our team." He delivered this as if offering an extraordinary opportunity, not fulfilling a family obligation to employ his new daughter-in-law, somewhere visible but contained. The position was mid-level systems analyst, maintaining existing security infrastructure, running routine diagnostics. The salary was 30% less than I'd earned as an independent consultant, a fact Henry mentioned with the clear expectation I'd understand family came with certain financial sacrifices. The work sounded unchallenging, but Henry framed it as a foundation from which I could prove myself. Jack had encouraged me to accept it the night before, positioning it as an investment in our marriage. Stable schedules, no more travel, the ability to actually build a life together. His logic made surface sense. I told myself the pay cut was temporary, that I'd demonstrate my value and advance on merit, that working for my father-in-law's company would eventually open doors, not close them. I accepted the position the next day, officially joining Caldwell Technologies as both the CEO's daughter-in-law and an employee who happened to have relevant skills. The reality of the work revealed itself within the first week. Henry assigned me maintenance tasks and in turn could have handled updating firewalls, running audits on systems I could have redesigned from scratch to be infinitely more effective. When I drafted proposals for infrastructure improvements that would have saved millions and dramatically increased security, they were met with polite nods and then disappeared into filing systems. My suggestions in team meetings were acknowledged with a patronizing patience reserved for children who don't yet understand how the adult world operates. I was there to fulfill a role, not to contribute meaningfully. The company had hired me as proof of their progressive values, a credential they could point to when discussing diversity. Look at us. We have the CEO's daughter-in-law as a systems analyst. See how modern and merit-based we are. The irony wasn't lost on me. Simultaneously overeducated for my tasks and completely dismissed in my actual expertise. But I told myself it was temporary. I proved myself, earned recognition, advanced based on results. I was naive enough to believe performance would eventually matter more than politics. 6 months of that professional suffocation drove me to start building something in secret. Late nights, when the office emptied and only the janitorial staff remained, I designed a new security framework on my personal laptop. I stored everything on encrypted servers, completely disconnected from Caldwell systems. I called it the Sentinel Protocol, an architecture built on predictive threat analysis and pattern recognition algorithms I'd been refining for years. Every component was meticulously documented and patented under my maiden name through a limited liability company I registered in Delaware, Monroe Security Solutions. It was a shell company existing only on paper and in the digital infrastructure I was constructing, line by line, function by function. Jack never asked why I stayed late. Henry never questioned what I might be working on beyond my assigned maintenance tasks. They both operated under the comfortable assumption that I was simply trying to prove myself, putting in extra hours to earn acceptance from a family and company that had graciously taken me in. What they fundamentally failed to understand was that I'd stopped seeking their acceptance entirely. I was building an escape route, creating something that belonged exclusively to me in a world where everything else seemed to be slowly slipping from my control. The irony is, I wasn't planning to steal intellectual property from people who'd already demonstrated they didn't value my contributions enough to actually utilize them. I was creating insurance against a future I couldn't yet articulate, but somehow sensed approaching. Around our first anniversary, the marriage itself began its quiet disintegration. Jack started checking his phone obsessively during dinners, stepping into the bedroom to take calls from his father that apparently couldn't wait. When I asked about his day, his answers became vague, distracted. He stopped asking about my work entirely. Our conversations contracted to pure logistics. Whose turn to pick up groceries? Which bills needed paying? Whether we had plans for the weekend. I tried everything to revive what we had. I planned elaborate date nights that he'd cancel last minute for work obligations that were never fully explained. I suggested weekend getaways that never materialized because Henry needed him for some meeting or strategy session. I initiated conversations about our future, our plans, the life we talked about building together, and watched his eyes glaze over like someone mentally composing a grocery list. Family dinners at the Caldwell estate became regular torture sessions disguised as tradition. Patricia, Henry's wife and Jack's mother, had perfected the art of the subtle insult, delivered with a smile. Comments about my wardrobe, questions about my career ambitions phrased to suggest ambition itself was unseemly in a Caldwell wife. Pointed inquiries about when I provide grandchildren as if my primary value was strictly biological. Jack sat through these dinners in practiced silence, methodically cutting his food with surgical precision, never once defending me or redirecting his mother's commentary. His silence felt like complicity, like agreement expressed through strategic absence. Late at night, lying in bed next to a man who felt increasingly like a stranger, I'd stare at the ceiling, trying to pinpoint the exact moment everything shifted. But there was no single moment. It was erosion, gradual, relentless. The slow, patient work of water wearing down stone until the foundation developed cracks too deep to repair. The life I'd built with Jack Caldwell, I was beginning to understand, had been constructed on borrowed ground. I just didn't realize how soon the lease would expire or how brutal the eviction would be. The elevator ride to the executive floor that Tuesday morning felt different, though I couldn't have articulated why. I'd received an email the previous afternoon, brief, vague, almost deliberately uninformative. Performance evaluation. Quarterly review. Your presence required. Conference room B, 8:30 a.m. The phrasing struck me as odd. I'd attended dozens of quarterly reviews, and they were always team presentations, collaborative assessments of division-wide metrics, never individual performance evaluations. But I pushed the unease aside and prepared thoroughly, compiling 3 years of data documenting every success, every breach prevented, every dollar saved. I arrived at 8:15, 15 minutes early as always, carrying my tablet loaded with charts and graphs that told an undeniable story of excellence. The numbers were extraordinary. My division had prevented 3 major security breaches in the past year alone, any one of which could have cost the company millions. We'd exceeded performance targets by 42%. Client satisfaction scores had risen steadily under my oversight. I'd personally designed and implemented security protocols now being studied as case examples in industry publications. I felt confident walking into that conference room, maybe even proud. I had every reason to expect recognition. perhaps even a discussion of advancement. The conference room felt arctic when I entered, though the thermostat probably read a normal 70. Henry sat at the head of the table, but the people flanking him made my stomach drop before my conscious mind registered why. Marcus from operations, a man I'd interacted with perhaps twice in 3 years. And a woman in a dark suit I didn't recognize at all, holding a legal pad with the careful posture of someone whose job involved witnessing things and documenting them precisely. No one from my team was present. Not a single person who could corroborate my work, speak to the actual metrics, or provide any counterweight to whatever narrative was about to be constructed. I should have turned around and walked out right then. The setup was obvious in retrospect. Isolated, outnumbered, facing people with no direct knowledge of my contributions and no investment in acknowledging them. But I was still operating under the assumption that facts mattered, that documentation and evidence would speak for themselves. I took my seat across from Henry, setting my tablet on the table, ready to present the truth in data form. Henry didn't smile. He didn't offer coffee or make small talk or acknowledge the presentation I'd clearly prepared. He simply shuffled a stack of papers with theatrical precision, each movement deliberate and unhurried, designed to make me wait and wonder and feel the weight of my own uncertainty. When he finally looked up and spoke, his voice carried the smooth, practiced authority of someone who delivered difficult news many times before and had long since stopped feeling anything about it. Violet, he began, again using my first name with that familiar clinical distance. We've been reviewing your division's performance metrics over the past several quarters. Unfortunately, the results aren't meeting our expectations or the standards we've set for leadership positions within the company. The words registered individually before assembling into meaning. Performance metrics, not meeting expectations, standards for leadership positions. I actually thought for a moment he was talking about someone else's division, that there had been some administrative error and I'd been called to the wrong meeting. Then I saw his expression, not apologetic, not uncomfortable, but satisfied in a way that made my skin feel too tight. I understood with sudden, terrible clarity that this was exactly the meeting I'd been summoned to attend. I'm sorry, I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. But last quarter's numbers exceeded every projection by a significant margin. We beat targets by 42% across all key performance indicators. The security upgrades I implemented saved the company an estimated $4 million in potential breach damages and regulatory penalties. Client satisfaction scores have improved by 28% since I took over the division leadership. I reached for my tablet, fingers moving automatically to pull up the spreadsheets and charts I'd prepared, the visual representation of undeniable success. Henry didn't even glance at the screen. He just smiled, and that smile made something cold settle in my chest because I'd seen it before. It was the smile of someone who'd already won, who held all the meaningful cards, who knew that facts and evidence were irrelevant compared to the power to simply decide the outcome and enforce it. This isn't personal, Violet. It's business. He delivered the line with the casual confidence of someone who'd used it many times before, a phrase that absolved him of responsibility while maintaining the fiction of professional neutrality. The absurdity of the statement was almost impressive. How could firing someone based on fabricated performance issues be anything other than personal? But I saw the truth in his eyes, the calculation, the predetermined outcome, the certainty that he controlled the situation completely, and my protests were merely a formality to be endured before moving forward with what he'd already decided. He slid an envelope across the table with the same theatrical precision he'd applied to shuffling papers earlier. My full name was typed on the front in a formal business font. Miss Violet Monroe. Not Violet Caldwell, which I'd never legally become, but which family members occasionally used. Monroe. The use of my maiden name felt intentional, a subtle assertion that I'd never truly belonged to their family, that whatever connection I thought existed through marriage was being formally severed. Your termination is effective immediately, Henry continued, his tone suggesting he was reading from a script he'd memorized. Security will escort you to your desk to collect personal belongings. Your access credentials will be deactivated as of 9 o'clock this morning. Human resources will contact you regarding final paycheck and benefits termination procedures. The lawyer, because that's obviously what the unknown woman was, made a careful note on her legal pad, documenting every word. Marcus still wouldn't meet my eyes, staring at a spot somewhere past my left shoulder, as if eye contact might make him complicit in something he'd rather not acknowledge. And I sat there, holding that envelope, my termination letter, understanding that this had never been about my performance. This was about power and control, and Henry's need to eliminate anyone who threatened his narrative of singular genius, his position as the irreplaceable center of Caldwell Technologies. I'd become too competent, too visible, too successful in ways that reflected well on me rather than on him. The division I led was being recognized in industry publications. Clients were specifically requesting to work with my team. Other companies had started reaching out through back channels, subtle inquiries about whether I might be interested in leadership positions elsewhere. I thought those were signs of success, validation that my work mattered. What I'd failed to understand was that to someone like Henry, my success was a threat, my visibility a challenge, and my growing reputation something that needed to be eliminated before it eclipsed his own. I stood slowly, picking up the termination letter with hands that somehow didn't shake despite the adrenaline flooding my system. That would come later, the physical manifestation of shock, rage, and betrayal. But in that moment, I was functioning on autopilot, some deeper part of my brain taking over to navigate the immediate situation with a mechanical precision of pure survival instinct. I remember the way out, I said quietly, looking directly at Henry, holding eye contact until he was the one who looked away first. It's the same path I used when I built half the systems currently keeping this company operational. The systems that prevented those 3 breaches, the infrastructure that's generating the revenue that pays for this conference room, and your imported coffee, and whatever satisfaction you're getting from this moment. His expression flickered just for a second, something that might have been uncertainty or a recognition that he'd perhaps miscalculated something important. But it passed quickly, replaced by the smug satisfaction of a man who'd executed his plan perfectly and wasn't particularly concerned about long-term consequences he couldn't yet see coming. I collected my personal items under the watch of a security guard named Mitchell, whom I'd personally trained on our access protocols 6 months earlier. He wouldn't look at me either, standing 3 feet away, bearing witness to my humiliation with the uncomfortable posture of someone who knew this was wrong but had no power to change it. I packed my coffee mug with the chipped handle, the framed photo of my mother from my college graduation, a small succulent plant that had somehow survived 2 years in an office with recycled air and fluorescent lighting. These objects that had made my workspace feel marginally personal were now evidence of my temporary status, easily packed into a cardboard box and carried away. My security badge felt heavier than it should have when I dropped it in the return tray at the lobby desk. Angela, the receptionist, who I'd chatted with every morning for 2 years about her kids and her night classes and her dreams of eventually moving into an administrative role, couldn't meet my eyes. Neither could the junior developers I'd mentored or Peterson from IT, who stood watching from the hallway with the expression of someone observing a traffic accident, horrified but unable to look away. They all knew what I knew, what everyone in that building understood but would never say directly. Poor results was corporate code for we're removing you before you become too powerful, before your competence becomes so undeniable that we can't maintain the fiction that you're here as a favor rather than because you're genuinely valuable. The drive home felt surreal, disconnected, like watching footage of someone else's life. Traffic moved at its normal pace, people going about their ordinary routines, completely unaware that my professional identity had just been systematically dismantled. I drove automatically, my hands making the familiar turns while my mind cycled uselessly through disbelief, anger, humiliation, confusion. Why now, specifically? What had changed in the past few weeks to trigger this? The numbers were undeniable, the success documented and verifiable. Unless that was precisely the problem. Maybe I'd become too successful, too visible, too much of a threat to Henry's carefully maintained narrative that he was the singular genius behind Caldwell Technology's success. I thought about calling my mother, but I could already hear her voice saying the things she'd warned me about 3 years ago. Families like the Caldwells don't really accept outsiders, no matter how qualified you are or who you marry. I thought about calling Sarah, my best friend since college, but what would I even say? That I've been fired for being too good at my job? It sounded insane, even in my own head, the kind of paranoid conspiracy thinking that people dismiss as an inability to accept legitimate criticism. As I pulled into the parking garage of our downtown loft apartment, a new fear crystallized beneath the shock and anger. I would have to tell Jack that his father had fired me, that I was now unemployed, that the carefully constructed life we'd built together had just shifted fundamentally. Would he defend me? Would he demand answers from Henry? Would he stand up for his wife against his father's decision? The thought trailed off as I stepped into the elevator. But some part of me already knew the answer. Some part of me had known for months, had registered all the small signs and warnings I'd been deliberately ignoring because acknowledging them would have meant confronting truths I wasn't ready to face. The elevator doors opened onto our floor. I walked to our apartment door, keys in hand, dread settling in my stomach like a stone swallowed. I knew before I opened that door. Some instinct deeper than conscious thought had already read the situation and prepared me for what came next. I just hadn't imagined it would be quite this brutal. The key turned in the lock with its familiar click, and I pushed open the apartment door, expecting emptiness. Silence. Maybe a few hours to process what had just happened before having to explain it to anyone. Instead, I found Jack sitting at our kitchen island, like he'd been positioned there deliberately, waiting. The staging was obvious the moment I registered the scene. His posture too casual, too prepared, lacking any of the natural surprise someone would show if their spouse came home hours earlier than expected in the middle of a workday. A glass of scotch sat in front of him, despite the hour being barely past 10:30 in the morning. His laptop was open, angled just enough that I could see real estate listings on the screen. Not properties we might look at together for some future move or investment, but single-occupancy apartments and condos, filtered for one-bedroom spaces designed for a man living alone. He was dressed in the dark blue Henley shirt I'd bought him for his birthday 6 months ago, the one he'd said made him feel comfortable and confident. He looked utterly calm, while my world was still burning from the meeting that had ended less than an hour ago. "You're home early," he said, his tone carrying no surprise whatsoever. No concern, no alarm, just flat acknowledgement. The same voice he might use if I'd returned from running an errand to the grocery store. No question about why I'd come home. No inquiry into whether something was wrong. Nothing that would suggest he didn't already know exactly what had happened and why I was standing in our apartment at this unexpected hour. I set the cardboard box containing my personal office items on the counter between us. That pathetic small container that represented 3 years of my professional life, reduced to a coffee mug, a photo frame, and a plant that would probably die within a week without the specific care routine I'd established. The box made a hollow sound against the marble surface. "Your father fired me," I said, watching his face carefully for any sign of genuine reaction. Cited poor results as the reason. Funny thing about that, my results were actually the best in company history. 42% above target, 3 major breaches prevented, for $1 million saved. But apparently, that doesn't meet expectations. Jack took a slow, deliberate sip of his scotch, and I watched something shift in his expression. Not guilt, which would have required him to feel he'd done something wrong. Not shock, which would have meant this information was news to him. Just a kind of resigned finality, the look of someone who'd been waiting for this specific conversation to arrive and was now relieved to finally have it happening, so he could move on to whatever came next. He reached into a leather portfolio sitting on the counter beside his laptop. Expensive leather, the kind with his initials embossed in gold in the corner, a gift from his parents last Christmas, and slid a folded piece of paper across the marble surface toward me. The gesture was careful, deliberate, practiced. This wasn't spontaneous. He prepared this document, positioned it in that portfolio, probably rehearsed this exact moment in his mind multiple times. I picked up the paper and unfolded it with hands that had started to shake slightly. The adrenaline from the earlier confrontation with Henry finally catching up to my nervous system. What I found inside made my breath catch in a way that the firing itself hadn't quite managed. A printed list of women's shelters in the city. 6 of them, arranged by neighborhood, complete with addresses and phone numbers. Each one highlighted in yellow marker. One was circled in blue pen with a handwritten annotation in Jack's distinctive angular script, closest to the metro line. He'd taken the time to research transit access. He'd evaluated which shelter would be most convenient for a woman without a car, without resources, without anywhere else to go. The cruelty of it was almost artful in its precision. Not just abandonment, but abandonment with a transit map. Not just rejection, but rejection with logistics carefully planned out. Now that you're unemployed, Jack said, his voice carrying the same dispassionate, professional tone he used for conference calls with clients, completely stripped of anything resembling emotion or personal connection. This arrangement doesn't work for me anymore. I need someone who can contribute. Someone who's ascending, not falling. The words landed like individual, physical blows, each one hitting a different part of my chest. This man I'd shared a bed with for 2 years, built what I believed was a life partnership with, defended to my own mother when she'd warned me about marrying into wealth and ego. This man was talking about our marriage like it was a business partnership that had failed to generate expected returns. I was being evaluated on the same metrics as a quarterly earnings report, and I'd been found insufficient. You knew, I said, and it wasn't a question because the answer was written in every detail of this moment. From a scotch he'd poured in preparation to the shelter list he'd researched and printed and positioned for easy access. His slight nod confirmed what I'd already understood. Dad told me last week that he was planning to restructure your division. I figured we should both prepare for new chapters in our lives. It seemed like the practical thing to do. Restructure. The euphemism was almost beautiful in its cowardice, the way it transformed deliberate termination into something that sounded like natural organizational evolution. I looked down at the shelter list again, then around at the apartment we'd furnished together over the past 2 years. The abstract paintings on the walls. I'd chosen most of them from a local gallery, spent hours selecting pieces that felt meaningful. The bookshelf where my technical manuals shared space with his business biographies. The kitchen where we'd hosted dinner parties and cooked meals together and pretended we were building something real and lasting. You think I need this list? I asked quietly, holding up the paper that had suddenly become the most insulting object I'd ever been handed. He shrugged, the gesture casual and dismissive. I'm just being practical. You don't have family money to fall back on. You'll need resources, somewhere to stay while you figure things out. I thought it would be helpful to have options researched ahead of time. The assumption underlying his words was staggering, that I was helpless without him and his family's resources, that I had nothing of my own, no value independent of the Caldwell name and the access it provided. That firing me and discarding me would leave me desperate and broken, scrambling for shelter space and metro fare. He'd actually convinced himself that providing this list was a kindness, a practical gesture from someone who'd thought ahead about my needs. I stood there holding that shelter list, and suddenly the full architecture of their betrayal assembled itself in my mind with devastating clarity. This wasn't impulse or a sudden decision. This was coordination, careful planning, a strategy executed between father and son with the same precision they'd applied to any business deal. Henry had told Jack a week ago, 7 full days, which meant Jack had spent an entire week knowing that his father intended to fire me, knowing that he himself intended to end our marriage. And he'd said nothing. He'd continued the performance of normal life, sitting across from me at breakfast, kissing me goodbye when I left for work, asking casual questions about my day when I came home, all while holding the secret like ammunition he was waiting for the right moment to use. How many nights had he lain in bed next to me, planning this exit? How many conversations had father and son had about the problem of Violet, the wife who'd become inconvenient, the employee who'd become too competent and too visible and too much of a threat to their carefully maintained hierarchy? I thought back to our first anniversary, to the gradual cooling of Jack's affection over the months that followed, his increasing absences and vague explanations about where he'd been and what was consuming so much of his time and attention. It hadn't been normal marriage growing pains or the natural evolution of a relationship moving past its honeymoon phase. It had been preparation, strategic emotional divestment. He'd been withdrawing his investment gradually, protecting himself from the fallout he knew was coming, ensuring that when the moment arrived to execute his exit, he'd already insulated himself from feeling much of anything about it. And I blamed myself. For months, I'd internalized the distance as my own failure, not trying hard enough, not being attentive enough, not being a good enough wife. I'd auditioned desperately for a role that had already been recast, performing for judges who'd rendered their verdict and were just waiting for the appropriate moment to deliver it. The shame of that realization burned hotter than the anger, seared deeper than the betrayal itself. I'd been so carefully managed, so thoroughly manipulated, and I participated in my own deception by wanting so badly to believe that this marriage was real. "I'll be gone by morning," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt, pulled from some reserve of dignity I hadn't known I still possessed. Jack actually looked relieved, his shoulders dropping slightly as tension released. He'd probably anticipated arguments, tears, desperate negotiations. My calm acceptance clearly registered as the best possible outcome. A clean break with no drama, no complications, no messy emotional scenes that might create awkwardness or require him to feel uncomfortable about his choices. He didn't see what was happening inside me in that moment. Not rage, well, that would come later. Not grief, though that was there, too, buried under layers of more immediate reactions. What crystallized in my chest as I stood there holding that insulting shelter list was something colder and more precise than either of those emotions. It was clarity, sharp-edged, and absolute, cutting through every illusion and self-deception I'd been maintaining about who these people were and what I'd actually meant to them. By the way, if you're still with me, make sure to hit that subscribe button. More unbelievable stories like mine are coming your way. I packed methodically that evening while Jack stayed in the living room, probably scrolling through those real estate listings, planning his next chapter with the same casual efficiency he'd applied to ending this one. I didn't take everything. That would have required multiple trips and extended this humiliation over more time than I could stand. I took only what mattered, what was actually mine, rather than props in the life I'd been performing. My laptop, which contained 3 years of work and documentation. My backup drives, labeled innocuously as personal photos and family documents. The external hard drive I'd kept hidden in the back of my closet, which contained every patent filing, every line of proprietary code, every piece of documentation related to Monroe Security Solutions. I left behind the jewelry Jack had given me for birthdays and anniversaries. Expensive pieces that had never felt quite like mine, always too formal, too much about displaying wealth, and not expressing anything personal. The designer, clothes his mother, had encouraged me to buy garments that had never fit quite right because they were designed for someone playing a different role than I was capable of inhabiting. All the trappings of the life I'd been auditioning for, trying to fit myself into like clothing size for someone else's body. What Jack didn't know, what Henry didn't know, was that I wasn't Violet Monroe, struggling unemployed tech worker facing homelessness. I was Violet Monroe, founder and primary patent holder of the security architecture that powered every significant system at Caldwell Technologies. They thought they'd fired an employee, discarded an inconvenient wife, eliminated a problem. What they'd actually done was terminate their license agreement with the architect who'd built the foundation their entire company stood on. And that license, with its carefully constructed renewal clauses and good faith provisions, was about to expire. I left the apartment before dawn the next morning, carrying 2 suitcases and the cardboard box from my office, leaving behind a marriage and a life that had never truly belonged to me. The city was still dark, streetlights casting orange pools on empty sidewalks. As I loaded everything into my car, I drove downtown to the Riverside Hotel, a mid-range establishment where the front desk staff asked no questions when I paid cash for a week's stay and requested a room on the upper floors with decent wireless reception. Room 847 became my operations center. The space was generic, as all hotel rooms are: bland art on the walls, furniture designed for temporary occupancy, the faint smell of industrial cleaning products and previous guests. I spread my laptop and backup drives across the desk, positioning everything with the methodical precision of someone preparing for surgery. The lighting was terrible for extended computer work, but I didn't care. I pulled up the licensing agreement I drafted 2 years earlier when Caldwell Technologies had first acquired what they believed was my security framework. And I began reviewing every clause with the focused intensity of someone whose entire future depended on the accuracy of legal language written in a very different emotional state. The Sentinel protocol that powered every significant security system at Caldwell Technologies wasn't theirs. It had never been theirs, despite whatever assumptions Henry and his lawyers had made about ownership and acquisition. They'd licensed it from Monroe Security Solutions, the shell company I'd registered in Delaware specifically to protect my intellectual property from people who'd already demonstrated they didn't value my contributions enough to actually acknowledge them. The license agreement itself was 37 pages of dense technical and legal language that Henry and his attorneys had apparently skimmed rather than studied, operating under the assumption that it was standard software licensing boilerplate, the kind of document you sign because the technology was valuable and the terms were probably reasonable and nobody expected problems down the road. They'd been catastrophically wrong about that assumption. Buried in Section 12, subsection D, was a clause I'd written with particular care, knowing even then that I needed protection built into the architecture of any agreement I entered with the Caldwell family. The clause gave me unilateral termination rights in the event of a material breach of good faith dealing with the intellectual property creator. Section 19 defined that creator explicitly and exclusively as any individual or entity holding primary patents on the licensed technology, which meant me, and only me, since I'd been meticulous about filing every patent under my maiden name through the Delaware LLC that existed nowhere except on official documents. The license renewal date was 72 hours away. Without my explicit approval, their entire security infrastructure would begin experiencing cascading failures that would start small and escalate exponentially as systems tried and failed to authenticate against protocols that were no longer being maintained or updated. I sat in that hotel room, reviewing the documents, until my eyes burned from screen glare and my back ached from sitting in a chair not designed for extended use. Then I began drafting the formal notice that would trigger everything that came next. At 2:15 in the morning, unable to sleep despite an exhaustion that made my hands shake slightly as I typed, I finalized the language. The notice was brief, professionally phrased, almost polite in its tone. Pursuant to Section 12D of License Agreement MT 2847, Monroe Security Solutions hereby provides notice of material breach regarding treatment of intellectual property creator. Automatic license renewal is suspended pending contract renegotiation and resolution of outstanding grievances. This suspension becomes effective at 0600 hours Eastern Standard Time, September 24th. I attached a PDF copy of the original licensing agreement with specific provisions highlighted in yellow marker, the same color Jack had used when highlighting homeless shelters on the list he'd prepared for my convenience. The visual parallel felt appropriate, a small gesture of symmetry that probably no one else would notice, but that satisfied something in me that needed these betrayals to connect to their consequences in visible ways. I scheduled the email to send automatically at 6 o'clock the following morning to Caldwell Technologies' legal department, copying Henry and Peterson, the head of IT, who'd spent 2 years dismissing my suggestions and then watching uncomfortably from the hallway as I was escorted out of the building. Then I did something that would seem small, but that carried enormous technical weight. I accessed the back-end administration panel of the Sentinel protocol using credentials that Henry had never thought to revoke because he'd never understood that they existed or what they controlled. With a series of keystrokes that took less than 30 seconds to execute, I suspended the automatic license renewal that had been scheduled to process in 72 hours. The systems wouldn't crash immediately or catastrophically. That would have been too obvious, potentially creating legal liability for deliberate sabotage. Instead, they would begin experiencing what would appear to be random authentication failures. Client access portals would start lagging unpredictably. Internal communications would flag false security threats. Security certificates would time out one by one as the renewal protocols failed to verify against a license that no longer existed. It would feel like a building where the foundation was slowly crumbling, unnoticed at first, but becoming impossible to ignore as walls began cracking and floors started settling unevenly. I closed my laptop, set an alarm for 6:30 the following morning, and tried to sleep. My mind wouldn't cooperate, cycling through scenarios and contingencies and possible responses they might attempt. But my body insisted on rest, and eventually exhaustion won over anxiety. The first call came at 6:04 in the morning, exactly 4 minutes after the systems would have started experiencing their initial failures. Henry's office line, marked as urgent in my caller identification. I watched it ring through to voicemail while sipping coffee I'd made using the in-room machine, bitter and weak, but caffeinated enough to serve its purpose. 3 minutes later, another call from a different Caldwell Technologies number. Then another. Then Jack's personal cell, which I'd already blocked the previous evening, so it went straight to a notification I dismissed without reading. Henry's personal cell phone declined. Peterson from IT declined. Someone from their legal department, whose name I didn't recognize, declined. By noon, my phone displayed 78 missed calls and a cascading flood of text messages that grew increasingly desperate in tone as the morning progressed, and I continued not responding. The messages told their own story of mounting panic. Early ones were professionally phrased. Violet, we need to discuss some technical issues. Please call at your earliest convenience. Then the facade started cracking. This is urgent. Please respond immediately. Then the pretense of professional courtesy disappeared entirely. Whatever this is about, we can work it out. Just call me back. And finally, from Henry himself, a message that arrived just after 11:30. Name your price. Name my price. As if this were simply a negotiation about money. As if everything in the world came down to finding the correct number to write on a check and watching problems disappear. The assumptions embedded in those 3 words told me everything I needed to know about how fundamentally Henry had misunderstood what was happening and why. I let them sweat for 3 days. Not out of cruelty, though I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in knowing they were panicking while I sat calmly in a hotel room drinking bad coffee and reading industry news. The silence was strategic, calculated to achieve specific objectives. I needed them to fully understand the extent of their dependency on systems I'd built. I needed them to bring in outside consultants who would scratch their heads at code that was simultaneously brilliant in its architecture and completely impenetrable without documentation that only the original architect possessed. I needed Henry to sit in emergency board meetings, trying to explain to increasingly angry board members why the company's competitive advantage was evaporating like fog in morning sunlight. I needed Jack to realize that his father had made a catastrophic miscalculation when he decided to fire me. And I needed time to feel the other calls that were starting to come in. The good ones from companies who'd heard through industry back channels that something interesting was happening at Caldwell Technologies and that the architect behind their security systems might suddenly be available for other opportunities. On the second night, sitting in that hotel room with takeout food going cold on the desk beside my laptop, I finally called my mother. She answered on the first ring, and I could hear the relief flooding her voice before she'd even finished saying hello. "Violet, baby, where are you? Jack's been calling me saying you left, that you're not answering your phone, that he's worried." "Mom, I need you to listen." I interrupted, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. Something in my tone made her go immediately quiet. That maternal instinct that recognizes when a child needs space to speak without interruption. I told her everything. The firing based on fabricated performance issues, the shelter list Jack had prepared with transit annotations, the coordinated betrayal between father and son, the license agreement they'd never properly read, the systems that were currently failing in ways they couldn't fix without me. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line, the kind of quiet that feels heavy with processing and emotional recalibration. Then she said something I hadn't expected, something that broke through the careful control I'd been maintaining for 2 days. I have $48,000 in savings. It's yours if you need it. My mother, who'd raised me alone after my father died in a construction accident when I was 8, who'd worked double shifts as a nurse for 15 years to keep us housed and fed and to put me through college without debt, who'd never had extra money for vacations or luxuries or anything beyond the essentials of survival. She was offering me her entire financial security. "Mom, I don't need—" I started, but she interrupted me with the firmness that had gotten us both through the hardest years of my childhood. "I know you don't need it. You never did. You've been taking care of yourself since you were 16. But I need you to know you have it. You're not alone, baby. You never were." I broke then, not from sadness, but from something fiercer and more complicated. Gratitude and rage and determination, all mixing together into an emotional response I couldn't quite name or control. Tears came that I hadn't allowed myself since the moment Jack had slid that shelter list across the counter. "I'm going to make them understand what they did," I told her, my voice thick with emotions I was still trying to process. "I know you are," she said with absolute certainty, "and I'll be here when you do." That conversation changed something fundamental in how I understood what I was doing and why. This wasn't just about me anymore, about my hurt feelings or damaged pride or professional reputation. I was doing this for my mother, who'd never had the luxury of demanding fair treatment because survival didn't leave room for principles. For every woman who'd been told she was nothing without the man who married her. For everyone who'd ever been discarded like a quarterly report that didn't meet arbitrary projections. The calls from Caldwell Technologies continued. By the end of day 3, the count had exceeded 100, but I didn't answer any of them. I was done responding to their schedule. On the 4th morning, I woke at 5:30 without an alarm, my body's internal clock apparently convinced that this was the appropriate time to begin whatever came next. The hotel room was still dark, city lights filtering through curtains that didn't quite close properly, casting thin vertical lines across the ceiling that I'd been staring at for the past 3 nights whenever sleep proved elusive. But this morning felt different. The anxiety and second-guessing that had characterized the previous 72 hours had crystallized overnight into absolute clarity about what needed to happen next. I made coffee with the inadequate in-room machine, opened my laptop while it was still brewing, and began drafting the email that would fundamentally alter the power dynamic between myself and the Caldwell family. The message needed to be perfect, not emotional, not accusatory, just factual in a way that left no room for misinterpretation or negotiation about the reality of the situation they now found themselves in. I addressed it to Henry's private email address, the personal account he used for matters he preferred not to have documented in corporate systems where they might be subject to discovery requests or board oversight. No greeting, no preamble, no wasted words that might dilute the impact of what I was about to demonstrate. Just a single sentence. Please find attached documentation regarding the ownership and licensing structure of the security systems currently powering Caldwell Technologies operations. The first attachment was the complete licensing agreement for the Sentinel protocol, all 37 pages, with specific provisions highlighted in yellow. Section 12D, outlining material breach conditions and the termination rights that accompanied such breaches. Section 19, providing explicit definition of intellectual property creator as the individual or entity holding primary patents on the licensed technology. Section 23, detailing my unilateral authority to terminate or suspend the license under specified circumstances, which included, and I've been very careful about this language when drafting the original agreement, treatment of the creator that could reasonably be interpreted as acting in bad faith or failing to acknowledge their contributions appropriately. The second attachment contained every patent filing I'd submitted over the past 3 years for components of the Sentinel protocol, each one registered to Monroe Security Solutions 2 to 3 years prior, months before Caldwell Technologies had supposedly acquired the system through what they believed was a straightforward technology purchase. Each filing listed me as the sole inventor, my maiden name appearing on every official document in the place where ownership and creative credit were formally established and legally protected. Henry had apparently never investigated any of this. Why would he? I was just his son's wife, hired as a diversity checkbox to demonstrate the company's progressive values. Someone presumably too grateful for the opportunity to cause complications or assert inconvenient legal rights. The arrogance embedded in that assumption was almost impressive in its completeness. At the bottom of the email, below the two attachments, I added a single line that felt appropriate given the circumstances. You fired the architect. The building is noticing. I hit send at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, the same time their systems had begun experiencing cascading failures 4 days earlier. The symmetry felt important, a way of marking the connection between cause and effect, between their decision to discard me and the consequences that were now materializing in ways they were only beginning to understand. My phone rang at 7:14 a.m. Henry's private cell number, the one he gave to family and key business associates, not the office line that went through assistance and screening protocols. I let it ring 4 times before answering. A small, petty gesture that nonetheless satisfied something in me that needed him to wait, to experience even brief uncertainty about whether I would pick up at all. Violet. His voice carried none of the smooth authority I'd heard in that conference room 4 days ago. He sounded diminished somehow, like a man who'd just discovered that the foundation of his house had been built on land he didn't own, and that the actual owner had just informed him the lease was expiring. We need to meet face to face. There are things we should discuss that are too complicated for phone conversations. No, I said, keeping my voice calm and level, refusing to match any urgency or concern he might try to project. You need to listen. 3 years ago, you hired me as what you clearly viewed as a favor to your son. You treated me like a diversity checkbox, someone who should be grateful for the opportunity to exist in your orbit and perform whatever minor tasks you deemed appropriate for someone in my position. Silence on the other end of the line. I continued without waiting for him to formulate whatever response he was trying to construct. You assigned me maintenance work that was beneath my capabilities, and you never bothered to learn what I was actually building during all those late nights you probably assumed I was spending trying to prove myself worthy of your family's acceptance. When you needed to upgrade your security systems 2 years ago, I provided the solution through a licensing agreement that your lawyers apparently didn't read with appropriate care. You thought you were acquiring technology outright. You were renting it from me. That's not. Henry started, but I cut him off before he could complete whatever denial or rationalization he was attempting. The license renewal came due 3 days ago. I declined to approve it. Every system currently keeping your company operational is now running on borrowed time that's counting down with each hour that passes. Your client portals are experiencing authentication failures. Your internal communications are flagging false security threats. Your competitive advantage is evaporating in real time. And all of it traces directly back to the woman you fired for supposedly poor results that were actually the best performance metrics in company history. Another silence, longer this time, heavy with the sound of a man processing information that was rewriting his understanding of his own situation. When he spoke again, his voice had changed in fundamental ways. Smaller, uncertain, stripped of the confidence that came from believing he controlled all the relevant variables. What do you want to file it? The question revealed how completely he'd misunderstood what was happening and why. He still thought this was a negotiation, that everything came down to finding the right price point or arrangement that would make the problem disappear and allow everyone to return to their previous positions with minimal disruption. Justice, I said, but I'll settle for watching you explain to your board of directors why your company's entire infrastructure is held together with licensing agreements controlled by the woman you just fired for fabricated performance issues. Henry tried to recover his footing, shifting into the mode he probably used in difficult business negotiations when he needed to salvage deals that were going poorly. We can offer you reinstatement immediately. Better title than you had before. Vice president level. Equity stake in the company. I can have the board approve a compensation package by end of week that includes full benefits, substantial signing bonus, guaranteed seat at executive strategy meetings, whatever it takes to make this right. I don't want to work for you, Henry, I said, and I meant it with a clarity that surprised me with its completeness. I want you to understand what you destroyed wasn't just a job. It was a partnership you never deserved and never appreciated until it was too late to matter. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, each exhale carrying the weight of a man realizing he'd miscalculated catastrophically, that he'd eliminated what he'd perceived as a minor problem and had actually triggered the collapse of something foundational that he hadn't known existed. The licensing agreement can be terminated with 30 days' notice, I continued, letting the implications of that timeline settle, or it can be renegotiated under new terms that would require certain acknowledgments. That renegotiation would need to include formal documentation of material breach, which means board minutes recording that you fired your chief security architect based on fabricated performance issues, while she was actually delivering the best results in company history. It means explaining to your investors why you didn't know that the foundation of your company belonged to someone else. It means acknowledging publicly what you did and why it was wrong. You're trying to destroy the company, Henry said, and I heard anger creeping back into his voice as he grasped for a narrative that made me the aggressor rather than someone responding appropriately to how I'd been treated. No, I corrected firmly. I'm teaching you the cost of underestimation. The company can't survive this situation if appropriate changes are made. The real question is whether you can survive it, whether your position and reputation can withstand the truth about what happened and why. I ended the call before he could respond, not out of drama, but because the conversation had served its purpose, and anything further would have diminished the impact of what had already been said. I turned my phone to Do Not Disturb mode and opened my laptop to check email. The industry had moved faster than I'd anticipated. Within hours of Caldwell Technologies' system failures becoming visible to clients and competitors, my inbox had begun filling with messages from people who'd somehow learned pieces of the story and wanted to know more or explore possibilities. Sarah called that afternoon, her number coming through despite the Do Not Disturb setting because I'd marked her as an emergency contact years ago. "You're a legend in tech circles right now," she said, her voice carrying equal parts awe and amusement. "People are calling it the quietest power move of the decade. Caldwell stock is tanking, and nobody could figure out why until someone traced it back to a licensing dispute with Monroe Security Solutions, which nobody had heard of, which turns out to be you. 2 companies reached out with vice president-level offers that same day. Another wanted to discuss possible acquisition of Monroe Security Solutions itself, which struck me as deeply ironic given that it was essentially a shell company I'd created specifically to protect intellectual property from people like Henry. I'd been invisible at Caldwell Technologies for 3 years. My contributions systematically erased or attributed to Henry's leadership. Now that same industry was scrambling to understand how I'd built something so essential that its removal threatened a multi-billion-dollar company. I had 3 formal job offers, each one paying more than double what Caldwell had. One came with a signing bonus that exceeded Jack's annual salary. I reviewed them carefully, considering not just compensation, but culture and opportunity, and whether I'd be walking into another situation where my contributions would be undervalued. I accepted the most prestigious offer before midnight, feeling something shift in my chest as I typed the acceptance email. This wasn't just about leaving Caldwell Technologies behind. It was about stepping into something I'd built for myself on my own terms, with people who actually understood what I was worth. The acceptance email sat in my sent folder like a line drawn in the sand, marking the boundary between what had been and what would come next. I closed my laptop and sat in that hotel room, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Anticipation that wasn't tinged with dread. My phone continued buzzing with notifications I wasn't reading. Missed calls from numbers I'd stopped recognizing as relevant. The Caldwell family's panic had become background noise. Static. I'd learned to tune out while focusing on the future I was actively constructing. 6 weeks passed in a blur of onboarding meetings, team introductions, and the particular chaos that accompanies starting a senior leadership position at a company that's scaling rapidly. Titanium Solutions operated differently than Caldwell Technologies in ways that became apparent immediately. People actually listened when I spoke in meetings. My technical recommendations were implemented rather than filed away. The CEO, a woman named Rebecca, who'd built the company from a startup, treated expertise as valuable rather than threatening. It was disorienting at first, this environment where competence was rewarded instead of resented. Then the news broke publicly, and everything changed again. Caldwell Technologies issued a press release on a Thursday afternoon, timed strategically for aftermarket close to minimize immediate trading impact. Sarah forwarded it to me with a single word in the subject line: finally. The statement itself was a masterpiece of corporate obfuscation. Each word carefully selected to communicate information while admitting nothing that might increase legal liability. Following an internal review of operational practices and governance procedures, Caldwell Technologies announces a restructuring of its security division and leadership team. CEO Henry Caldwell has agreed to temporary administrative leave pending a comprehensive evaluation of corporate governance practices and decision-making protocols. The board of directors has appointed an interim leadership committee to oversee operations during this transition period. To anyone not familiar with corporate communication patterns, it might have sounded routine, the kind of planned announcement companies issue regularly about organizational changes. But to anyone paying attention, every phrase signaled catastrophe barely contained. Internal review meant something had gone badly wrong. Temporary administrative leave meant the CEO had been forced out. Comprehensive evaluation meant investigators were examining everything with suspicion about what they might find. Sarah called within minutes of forwarding the release. "This is bigger than I thought," she said without preamble. "I'm hearing there was an emergency board meeting last week that went 7 hours." Henry had to explain the licensing dispute, admit that the company's core technology was controlled by his former daughter-in-law, justify why he'd fired you for performance issues when your actual performance was exceptional. 2 board members resigned immediately rather than be associated with whatever legal liability this creates. The stock dropped 18% before trading was halted. I sat at my desk at Titanium Solutions, watching the city lights come on as afternoon faded into evening, processing this information with complicated emotions I couldn't quite sort through. Part of me felt vindicated. They were finally facing consequences for decisions they'd made so cavalierly. Part of me felt strangely empty, like I'd been preparing for a confrontation that was now happening without me present to witness it. Tech news outlets picked up the story within hours, though they didn't have my name yet. The coverage focused on the licensing dispute angle, speculation about governance failures, questions about how a major tech company could build its competitive advantage on technology it didn't actually own. Industry analysts published pieces with headlines like "The Hidden Risks of Technology Licensing" and "When Founders Don't Read the Fine Print." Henry issued a second statement through his attorney about renegotiating technology partnerships in good faith, but the market had already rendered its judgment. Confidence had evaporated, and with it the assumption that Caldwell Technologies was a stable investment. Jack started calling again during week 7. I'd unblocked his number by then, curious about what he might say now that the situation had become public and undeniable. His voicemails told their own story of progressive desperation. The first one carried irritation. "Violet, I don't know what you're doing, but you need to stop this. People are getting hurt. Jobs are at risk. You're destroying something my father spent his life building." I deleted it without responding. The second message, 3 days later, shifted to confusion. "I know you're angry. You have every right to be angry about how things ended, but can we just talk? Figure out some way to resolve this that doesn't involve taking down the entire company." Delete. By the third message, panic had crept into his voice. "Dad's under investigation. The board is talking about forcing him out permanently. His reputation is being destroyed. Is that what you wanted? To humiliate him publicly?" The assumption embedded in that question was almost amusing, that I'd orchestrated this outcome through careful planning rather than simply withdrawing support they'd taken for granted while treating me as disposable. On week 8, Jack appeared at my new office building downtown. I was in a meeting when security called to inform me that someone claiming to be my husband was in the lobby requesting to see me. I pulled up the security camera feed on my phone and watched him standing there, holding expensive roses, the kind you purchase when desperation has replaced thoughtfulness, when you need a gesture that looks significant without requiring actual understanding of what the other person might want. He looked smaller somehow than I remembered, not physically diminished, but reduced in some fundamental way that had nothing to do with height or weight. The confidence he'd carried so easily during our marriage had been replaced by uncertainty that showed in his posture, the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot while waiting for the security guard to return with a response. "We're separated," I heard him say when the guard asked about his relationship to me, and the word choice struck me as characteristic of Jack's approach to difficult situations. Separated suggested something temporary, circumstantial, a condition that might be resolved through negotiation or changed circumstances. It sanitized what had actually happened, made it sound mutual and reversible rather than the deliberate abandonment it had been. The security guard called up to my office. "Ms. Monroe, there's a Jack Caldwell here to see you. Says he's your husband. Should I send him up?" I looked at the monitor showing Jack standing in the lobby, holding flowers that were already starting to wilt slightly under the artificial lighting. And I felt nothing. Not anger anymore, not grief, not even satisfaction at his obvious discomfort. Just a kind of neutral observation, like watching a stranger deal with a problem that had nothing to do with me. "No," I said. "Tell him I'm in a meeting that's running long. He should try calling if he needs to discuss something." I watched on the monitor as the guard delivered this message, and Jack's face registered first confusion, then frustration, then something that looked like resignation. He left the flowers on the reception desk and walked out, shoulders hunched against a cold that was as much emotional as meteorological. My new position at Titanium Solutions provided exactly what Caldwell Technologies had denied: autonomy, resources, and recognition. I had a team of 20 engineers who'd been selected for competence rather than politics, a budget that allowed us to actually implement ideas rather than just propose them, and leadership that understood the difference between control and trust. More importantly, I had the freedom to build something new without constantly defending its existence. We launched Sentinel Protocol 2 at a major tech conference in November, 2 months after my termination from Caldwell Technologies. The timing was deliberate, giving me enough distance to make it clear this wasn't a reactive move, but rather the natural evolution of work I'd been doing for years. The presentation was mine to deliver. My name featured prominently in the program and promotional materials. My face on screens as I talked about adaptive security architecture that learned from threats rather than just responding to them. The audience included several companies I recognized as Caldwell Technologies clients. I saw their representatives taking careful notes, asking detailed questions during the Q&A session about migration timelines and compatibility requirements, and whether the new framework could integrate with existing systems or required complete replacement. Within 3 weeks, for major clients had formally requested proposals for switching their security infrastructure from Caldwell to Titanium Solutions. The market was voting with contracts, and the verdict was unmistakable. They preferred working with the architect rather than the company that had discarded her. Sarah called after the conference presentation, her laughter carrying genuine delight. "You just declared war without firing a single shot. That was the most professionally devastating thing I've ever witnessed." "It's not war," I replied, meaning it. "It's just better engineering. The technology speaks for itself." But late one evening, working alongside Clara on a particularly stubborn debugging problem, she asked me something that cut through all the professional success and public vindication to expose something I've been trying not to examine too closely. "Do you feel satisfied?" Clara asked, looking up from her screen with a directness that made her an excellent engineer and occasionally an uncomfortable colleague. Watching Caldwell Technologies implode, Henry under investigation, Jack showing up with desperate flowers. "Is it what you thought it would be?" I opened my mouth to say yes, automatically, to confirm that justice felt exactly right, that they deserved every consequence that was materializing for decisions they'd made. But the words caught in my throat because the truth was significantly more complicated than simple satisfaction. I felt vindicated, certainly, validated in ways that professional success alone couldn't provide. Proven right about my capabilities in their judgment. But satisfied? That wasn't quite accurate. There was a hollowness at the center of all this, like winning an argument with someone who'd already left the conversation, like being proven right about something that no longer mattered in the ways I'd once thought it would. What I'd actually wanted, I realized, wasn't revenge or destruction or even public vindication. I'd wanted recognition, acknowledgement that my contributions had value, that I mattered beyond my utility or my connection to the right family. I'd wanted Henry to see me as genuinely talented, rather than as his son's wife who'd been hired as a favor. I'd wanted Jack to love me for who I actually was, rather than for how I fit into the life he'd planned. But I would never receive that recognition from them. They lacked the self-awareness required for genuine apology, the humility necessary for real change. The best outcome I could realistically hope for was that they'd learned an expensive lesson about the cost of underestimating people. It's not about satisfaction, I finally told Clara. It's about building something they can't take away. Something that exists independently of whether they acknowledge it or not. She nodded slowly, like she understood more than I'd explicitly said. Perhaps she did. Perhaps that was the real commonality between people who'd left toxic workplaces. Not the specific details of betrayal, but the recognition that the revenge that matters isn't destruction, but creation. Not tearing down what hurt you, but building something new that can't be touched by the same hands that once discarded you. That night, alone in my apartment that was slowly starting to feel like home, rather than just temporary shelter, I drafted an email to Jack that I never sent. Words I needed to write, even knowing they'd never be read. You asked if destroying your father's company was what I wanted. I wanted partnership. I wanted respect. I wanted to build something meaningful together. You wanted a trophy wife. Your father wanted control. The difference between those desires is what destroyed everything, not anything I did afterward. I saved the draft and closed my laptop, understanding that some conversations happen only in your own mind, and that sometimes that's sufficient. The unsent email sat in my drafts folder for 2 days before I finally deleted it, accepting that some conversations exist only for the person writing them, serving their purpose without ever being read by their intended recipient. Life continued moving forward in ways that felt increasingly stable. My team at Titanium Solutions had launched 3 major client implementations. I'd hired 2 junior engineers who reminded me of myself at their age, brilliant, overlooked, hungry to prove themselves. My apartment had accumulated enough personal touches that it finally felt like home rather than temporary shelter. Then the letter arrived. A courier knocked on my apartment door on a Saturday morning, holding a manila envelope that required signature confirmation. Inside was a single sheet of heavy cream stationery, the kind with weight and texture that announced its expense before you'd read a single word. Henry Caldwell's personal letterhead was embossed at the top, his name in raised letters that you could feel with your fingertips. But what made me pause was that the letter itself was handwritten in fountain pen, the ink a deep blue-black that probably cost more per milliliter than my previous monthly grocery budget. The content was startling in its complete departure from anything I'd previously heard from Henry. Violet, I request the opportunity to speak with you in person, not as former employer to employee, but as one person to another. I have come to understand the magnitude of my errors in judgment. Whatever you believe about my motivations, please allow me one conversation. I will come to wherever you designate, whenever you're available. This is not a negotiation. It is a request for the chance to apologize properly. I read it 3 times, searching for the trap, the hidden manipulation, the strategic positioning that I'd learned to expect from every Caldwell family interaction. But the words just sounded tired, like an old man who'd finally calculated the full cost of decisions he couldn't undo and found the price steeper than he'd anticipated. Sarah thought I shouldn't go when I called to discuss it. He doesn't deserve your time or your attention, she said firmly. He fired you, humiliated you, coordinated with his son to discard you. Now that there are consequences, he wants absolution. That's not how it works. My mother disagreed when I asked her opinion that evening. Sometimes people need to say they're sorry out loud, she said, in the tone she'd used when I was young and struggling with whether to forgive a friend who'd hurt me. Not for you necessarily, but so they can live with themselves afterward. You don't owe him that opportunity, but you might owe yourself the closure of hearing him acknowledge what he did. I thought about it for 2 days, weighing whether seeing Henry again would provide anything meaningful or just reopen wounds that were finally starting to form scar tissue. Finally, I texted a single line to the phone number printed at the bottom of his letter. Coffee. Public place. Tuesday at 10 o'clock. His response arrived within 30 seconds. Thank you. We met at a cafe 3 blocks from my office at Titanium Solutions, neutral territory, where either of us could leave easily if the conversation became uncomfortable or unproductive. I arrived 5 minutes early and claimed a corner table with clear sight lines to the entrance, positioning myself so I wouldn't be surprised by his arrival. Henry walked in exactly at 10 o'clock, and the first thing I noticed was how much smaller he seemed than I remembered. Not physically smaller. He was still the same height, still carried himself with the posture of someone accustomed to occupying space. But something fundamental had diminished. The arrogance that used to fill rooms, the certainty that came from never questioning whether his decisions were correct, had contracted into something more uncertain, more human. He ordered coffee at the counter that he never drank, then sat down across from me with the careful posture of someone expecting verbal attack at any moment. Thank you for meeting me, he began, his voice lacking its usual command. The smooth authority I remembered had been replaced by something quieter, more tentative. I didn't respond, just waited. Some part of me wanted to make this difficult for him, to refuse the social niceties that might make this conversation easier. He'd requested this meeting. He could navigate the silence. Henry took a breath, hands wrapping around his coffee cup like it might provide warmth against a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. I convinced myself I was making a business decision when I fired you. That the company needed restructuring, that your division was becoming too autonomous, that consolidation was strategic and necessary for long-term growth. I was lying to myself. He paused, looking down at his untouched coffee before continuing. The truth is, you scared me. Not because you were incompetent, because you were brilliant in ways I didn't fully understand and couldn't control. You were building systems that I couldn't claim credit for, earning genuine loyalty from teams I'd hired but never inspired, making independent decisions without checking with me first. And instead of recognizing those things as success, as exactly what good leadership should enable, I saw them as a threat to my position and my narrative about being the irreplaceable genius behind the company. The honesty was unexpected, disarming in ways I hadn't prepared for. I'd anticipated excuses or justifications or attempts to minimize what had happened. Instead, he was offering something that sounded like actual self-awareness. So, you destroyed what you couldn't control, I said quietly. Yes. He looked directly at me for the first time since sitting down. And in doing so, I destroyed my company's future, my son's marriage, and whatever legacy I thought I was building. I turned something that could have been a genuine partnership into a power struggle that I've lost in every meaningful way. We talked for another 30 minutes, and I found myself listening with less anger than I'd expected. He didn't ask for anything. No request to renegotiate the licensing terms, no attempts to minimize consequences, no suggestions that we could somehow return to previous arrangements with minor adjustments. He just apologized, acknowledged what he'd done and why, and accepted that the damage was beyond simple repair. When we parted ways outside the cafe, I felt something shift that I couldn't quite name. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps a loosening of the anger I'd been carrying like armor. 2 weeks later, Jack tried his own approach to reconciliation. He showed up at my apartment building on a Thursday evening, waiting in the lobby until I came home from work. The security guard called up to ask if I wanted him removed, and I surprised myself by saying I'd come down. We sat in the building's small courtyard, November cold making our breath visible in the air between us. Jack looked exhausted, older than his 32 years should allow, with shadows under his eyes that suggested sleep had become difficult. "I don't expect forgiveness," he started, the words coming out rehearsed like he'd practiced this conversation multiple times. "I just need you to know that I was wrong about everything. About thinking your value was tied to your employment, about not defending you to my father, about that shelter list that I convinced myself was practical when it was just cruel. I waited because I could feel the but coming that would undermine everything." He just said, "But I do think we could start over. Not as we were. I know that's impossible. But maybe as people who once cared about each other and could learn to again, without my father's influence, without the company dynamics. Just as trying to build something real this time." "There is no justice, Jack," I said quietly. "There never was. When you handed me that shelter list, you showed me exactly who you are when loving someone becomes inconvenient or complicated. That's not something you start over from. That's foundational character revealing itself." "One mistake," he began, but I interrupted. "It wasn't one mistake. It was 3 years of choosing your father's approval over your wife's dignity. The shelter list was just the moment when I finally saw the pattern clearly enough that I couldn't ignore it anymore." He looked down at his hands, silent for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said again, like repetition might somehow change the mathematics of what had happened. "I know," I replied, "but sorry doesn't rebuild what you burned. It just acknowledges the ashes." After those conversations, I wrote 2 final emails. The first to Henry laid out clear boundaries, appreciation for his apology, acknowledgement that he seemed to genuinely understand what he'd done, but firm establishment that a professional relationship was the extent of what existed between us now. The licensing agreement would stand as written. He would pay fair market rates for continued use of technology his company needed. I would provide the contracted support required, nothing more. The second email, to Jack, was shorter, more direct. The answer to his question about starting over was no, not because of hatred, but because of an absent trust that couldn't be rebuilt from these particular ruins. I wished him well, genuinely, but from a distance that would remain permanent. I hit send on both emails and felt something release in my chest. Not quite peace, but something adjacent to it. Closure, I realized, wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It was simply deciding that the story was finished, that no additional chapters would be written, that what had happened could finally be relegated to past tense rather than continuing to occupy present awareness. The conversations had provided something I hadn't expected. Not resolution exactly, but completion. The ability to finally close a chapter that had been left hanging open, consuming energy I needed for building what came next. The emails sat in my sent folder like bookends, marking the official conclusion of a chapter that had consumed months of emotional energy and mental space. I closed my laptop and sat quietly in my apartment, feeling the particular stillness that follows significant closure. The anger that had sustained me through the worst moments had finally burned itself out, leaving behind something clearer and more sustainable. Not forgiveness, but the ability to move forward without constantly looking backward. 6 months after leaving Caldwell Technologies, Monroe Security Solutions had transformed from a protective shell into something substantial and real. Clara and I had formalized our partnership, combining her technical brilliance with my architectural vision to build a company that reflected values we'd both wished for in previous workplaces. We rented office space in a renovated building downtown, hired our first employees, and began the complicated work of turning theoretical principles into operational reality. The company we built looked nothing like Caldwell Technologies. We structured leadership to be genuinely collaborative rather than hierarchical. Profit sharing was built into employment contract from the beginning, ensuring that the people doing the work benefited proportionally from its success. We established mentorship programs specifically targeting women in technology who'd been told they were too aggressive, too ambitious, too direct, or simply too much for corporate environments that preferred compliance over competence. In March, we landed a major government contract, providing security infrastructure for federal database systems. The irony of that achievement wasn't lost on me. I'd gone from being fired for fabricated poor performance to being trusted with national security architecture. Our first year's revenue exceeded what Caldwell Technologies' entire security division had generated, a comparison I didn't seek out, but that Sarah gleefully provided after reviewing publicly available financial reports. Trade publications started requesting interviews, and I accepted selectively, careful to frame my narrative. A journalist from a major tech magazine asked how I'd rebuilt after such public professional failure. I chose my words deliberately. When someone tries to erase your contributions, the most powerful response isn't confrontation or destruction. It's building something so undeniably yours that they can never take credit for it. Something that exists completely independent of their acknowledgement or approval. The article ran with the headline, "The Architect Who Built Her Own Empire." And suddenly, I was receiving messages from young women across the industry. They shared stories that were depressingly familiar. Being overlooked for promotions, given to less qualified men. Having ideas dismissed in meetings, only to hear them praised when repeated by male colleagues. Being fired or forced out of positions after becoming too competent or too visible. My story wasn't unique. It was simply one example of a pattern so common, it had become normalized. Clara and I discussed this pattern over late-night strategy sessions, and from those conversations emerged the Monroe Fellowship Program. We created structured opportunities specifically for women who'd left toxic workplaces, providing technical training, professional development, resources, and perhaps most importantly, a community of people who understood what they'd experienced and why it mattered. My mother flew in for the opening of our expanded office space in May. I picked her up from the airport and drove her directly to the building, wanting her to see it before I explained what we'd built. She walked through the space slowly, taking in the glass walls that made work visible rather than secretive, the collaborative areas designed to facilitate genuine teamwork, the small kitchen where employees actually gathered for lunch rather than eating alone at their desks. Her eyes filled with tears as she turned to look at me. "Your father would have been so proud of you." We rarely talked about my father. He died in a construction accident when I was 8, leaving my mother alone with a second grader and financial obligations that should have been impossible to meet on a single nurse's salary. But she'd managed, through sheer determination, working double shifts for 15 years, never remarrying, never complaining, just moving forward with a quiet strength that I'd absorbed without fully recognizing it as the foundation of my own resilience. "I didn't do this alone, Mom," I said. "You taught me everything that made this possible. How to build from nothing. How to keep going when circumstances seem impossible." She shook her head firmly. "No, baby. I taught you how to survive. You taught yourself how to build, how to create rather than just endure. That's different, and it's all you." We spent that weekend together, just the two of us, having conversations we'd never had time for during my childhood, when her energy was consumed by keeping us housed and fed and functional. She talked about dreams she'd had before I was born, about the relationships she deliberately passed on because they would have diverted energy away from raising me, about the day she'd offer me her life savings and what it had meant to her when I told her I didn't need it. "I was never worried about you being broke," she admitted over coffee on Sunday morning. "I was worried about you being broken, having your spirit crushed by people who couldn't see your value. But you weren't broken. You were just gathering yourself, preparing for what came next." That conversation healed something I hadn't known needed healing. Guilt I'd carried for years about being the reason she'd sacrificed so much of her own life. "Raising you wasn't sacrifice," she said with the firmness that had gotten us both through the hardest years. "It was the best investment I ever made, and watching you now proves I was right." In June, Sarah called with news that shifted my world in unexpected ways. She was getting engaged, and she wanted me as her maid of honor. The wedding was planned for late September, and as I marked the date in my calendar, I realized with odd symmetry that it would fall exactly 1 year after Henry had fired me in that conference room. The wedding took place in a small garden venue, intimate and beautiful, in ways that felt authentic to Sarah rather than performed for others. I stood next to my best friend as she married someone who clearly adored her. And I realized with startling clarity that I was genuinely happy. Not performing happiness to convince myself or others. Not experiencing the grim satisfaction of watching former enemies face consequences, but feeling real joy for someone else's beginning. During the reception, Sarah pulled me aside to a quiet corner. "Thank you for being here," she said. "I know this must be strange, being at a wedding after everything that happened with Jack." "It's not strange at all," I told her. "Honestly, it's actually perfect. I'm watching someone I love choose a partner who genuinely deserves her. That's not painful. It's hopeful. It reminds me that good relationships actually exist." She hugged me tightly. "You're going to find that too, when you're ready for it." "Maybe," I said. "But right now I'm discovering something that might be better. I'm finding out who I am without needing someone else to define or validate me." Later that night, dancing with colleagues and strangers, and my mother, who'd had just enough champagne to become delightfully uninhibited, I felt something fundamental shift. The anger I'd been carrying like protective armor had finally transmuted into something lighter and more useful. Not forgiveness exactly, but release. I didn't need Henry or Jack to acknowledge what they'd taken from me, because I'd built something they couldn't touch or diminish. The most meaningful moment came in October when a young engineer named Maya joined Monroe Security Solutions. She was 26, brilliant in ways that reminded me of myself at that age, and recently laid off from a company that had told her she wasn't a cultural fit, the same coded language I'd encountered, meaning she'd been too competent or too direct or too unwilling to perform deference to mediocre leadership. I took her to lunch on her first day, and she asked me the question I'd been anticipating. "How did you actually do it? Go from being fired to building this company? Everyone talks about resilience and bouncing back, but what did that actually look like for you?" I thought carefully about how to answer honestly. I stopped waiting for permission to be valuable. I stopped believing that my worth was determined by whether other people recognized it. And I stopped building things for people who treated my contributions like favors they were granting me, rather than essential work that deserved appropriate compensation and respect. She nodded slowly, processing this. "I'm really angry," she admitted, "at the people who discarded me, at the systems that allowed it to happen, at myself for not seeing the warning signs earlier." "Good," I said. "Anger is useful fuel when it's directed appropriately. Just don't let it become your permanent destination. Use it to build something better, then let it go when you don't need it anymore." 6 months later, Maya led the team that landed our biggest client contract. When she presented the technical architecture at our company meeting, speaking with confidence and precision about security protocols she designed, I caught Clara's eye across the room, and we shared a smile that communicated everything without words. We built this, not just a company, but a genuine space where people like Maya could develop their capabilities without having to perform someone else's narrow version of acceptable behavior. That evening, driving home through the city, I passed Caldwell Technologies' building and felt nothing but mild curiosity about how different the interior must look now. New leadership had restructured operations. Henry had officially retired. Jack had relocated to the West Coast for what his LinkedIn profile described as a fresh start. The empire they'd attempted to build through control and hierarchy had contracted into something smaller, but perhaps more sustainable. I didn't feel triumphant observing this. I just felt free, finally unburdened by the need for their acknowledgement or their downfall, because I'd learned something essential through all of this. The most effective response to being erased isn't destruction of those who wronged you. It's building something so undeniably your own that they become irrelevant footnotes in a story they never understood they were losing the right to narrate. I drove home to my apartment, modest but genuinely mine, filled with furniture I'd chosen and books I actually read, and art that meant something personal rather than serving as expensive decor. My phone showed a text from my mother, "Proud of you every single day." I sat in my car for a moment after parking, engine off, city lights creating patterns through the windshield, and let myself feel the full weight and lightness of what I'd built from the ashes of betrayal. Then I went inside and opened my laptop to review proposals for the next phase of company expansion, because that's what architects do. We build. What would you have done if you were in my shoes that day Jack slid that list across the table? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.